Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome back to the lecture, 22nd lecture of this public policy analysis. In fact, this is I mistakenly stated previous lecture, but this is not the previous lecture. This is the public policy analysis. This should be the heading that should be over here. So, bit of a case of an overhang, let's say, or maybe a lack of sleep. Whatever you take it, but just take it as a joke. And go ahead and just ignore it, in fact. So it's the public policy analysis, lecture number 22. This is now the previous lecture, not the last one. What we did in the previous lecture was the start of cost benefit analysis. This is the last, as I stated in the lecture, it was the last major theme that we are covering in this course of public policy analysis and how we go about analyzing a public policy. Remember that all the themes that we are going to cover after that, they are pretty much the subgroups or the subcategories of what we have studied till now, all the methodologies, all those theoretical stuff, and all those calculations that we did. So cost benefit analysis is perhaps is another criteria, the major criteria for, and perhaps the most used criteria in terms of in terms of analyzing a public policy, and which, if you go ahead and become a public policy analyst, you would be using a lot in these kind of calculations. Now, when we studied the cost benefit analysis, we went through a bit of, as usually I do, a bit of theory of what exactly is the cost benefit analysis and how it helps us or the policy maker determine whether to go ahead with the policy implementation of a policy or not. Now, then I took you for a bit of a history ride, as I usually do, give you a bit of history, a bit of background on how it developed. We discussed about Jean Dupoit, the French engineer. We discussed about J.B. Say, what J.B. Say had to say about public works satisfying the demands of the people or the utility of the people and providing satisfaction. How Jean Dupoit, a French engineer, took it up and wrote a book about it, in which he gave the example of a town where this stone that is used for construction is found, and how he demonstrated, or he stated that if a road could be built over there, for example, this is the public work aspect of it. If a road could be built over there, then what kind of advantages accrue to that locality? And we studied and we also discussed that, as Dupoit said, and he demonstrated that it's not just one benefit or the perceived benefit. If the government is building a road, that is just the benefit in terms of government's view, that look, we built a road, so it would be easier for in terms of transportation of that material, and a lot of time would be saved. But then we discussed some of those aspects that the government didn't consider, but by default ended up helping that area. One was that other firms come in and competition prevails, which prevents that firm that is already there becoming a monopoly. Then as the firms come in, there are more job opportunities in that area, there is more development in that area, infrastructure changes in that area, transportation changes in that area, income rises in that area, the total product of that area rises. So with the development of industry, there is development of services. Obviously, when people would be coming in, they would be requiring stay, lodgings, homes, these sort of things. So you will have construction industry booming too in that town. So those are all the things that we considered during that debate, and importantly, I mentioned that I'm just mentioning the positive aspect, and Dupoit also mentioned the positive aspect, but in reality it could very well happen that government's intervention ends up or a government policy ends up hurting the people rather than helping the people. We did during the course, during the proceedings of these course in previous lectures, we've discussed quite a few policies, specifically the policy, power generation policy, that relates a lot to electricity generation, and how the policy adopted in the 1990s, mid-1990s, where the focus shifted from hydropower towards petroleum-based power, petroleum-based generation, how it has hurt the people over the long run and continues to hurt the people even now, in the form of some of the worst load shedding that at least I have seen during my lifetime, and other people also have. So that was what we discussed in terms of history. One of the things that I didn't mention, and I should have mentioned over there, was that from that French tradition of French engineers and their army corps, this tradition gradually transferred or gradually spread to other areas, to the most ambitious ones, the most ambitious of the lot that took up this line, of public works, and that they could help people, was in the United States and its corps of engineers in the army. They took it up assiduously. They built lots of infrastructure, including dams, roads, highways, major highways all over the country. They were of the view that what they said, what Jean Dupoit said, and what the French engineers have been doing over there, that's the way to go, and that definitely has many advantages over its disadvantages. Until now it continues. You have, in our country, you have the Frontier Works Organization, that's the Army Engineering Corps. They work all over the country. They work in some of the most inhospitable terrain, some of the most difficult areas, like the federally administered tribal areas. They build roads over there. They build infrastructure over there. So this tradition goes back to Jean Dupoit and J.B. Say. You would find references over there. You would find references even dating back before that. But this is what modern government intervention in the form of public works is traced to. This is where we trace it to, that thinking. The micro and macro level distinction, the uses of IRR and present value discount. We said that when we are doing this cost benefit analysis, there are two levels, at micro level and a macro level. At micro level, you can use IRR, present value discount. At micro level, in fact, you can just do a simple cost and benefit analysis in money terms. Come up with an estimate that this much money would be our expenditure, and this much money is what we expect the gain to be, and just go ahead and implement that project by studying the ratio, by dividing the benefits by the cost. That is as simple as that, if you are just doing it at very small scale. Then the macro level distinction is a bit subtle. It's a bit challenging. It's a bit challenging in the sense that you have to use the concept of opportunity cost in trying to decide which project to go ahead. First of all, you use the opportunity cost concept to pick between the projects. Use IRR, use present value, net present value discount methods that we've already studied, and come up with a projection. In the end, again, you would be calculating a cost-benefit ratio, and after discounting for all the factors, after discounting for all the costs, all the benefits, and then you'd come up with the number, come up with the ratio, and see that this ratio, and then decide whether, going by the ratio, it's fine to go ahead with the project or not. Now, in the end, we did example of a cost and benefit analysis. And remember, I said that there is a bit of a distinction over here from the calculations that we did in the case of IRR, the simple calculations in the case of IRR and the present value that we did in one of the previous lectures. And what exactly was the distinction? Let me just again demonstrate it to you just to make you understand. So suppose, for the sake of argument, that we are considering a project that would take about 6 years to complete. If that would take 6 years to complete, then you need to discount the interest rate to, or the rate that you've selected. So suppose this is the 5th year and the rate that we've selected is 7%, as we did in the previous lecture, I believe. So what would the discount rate in the 5th and 6th years look like? Well, in the 5th year, the discount rate would be 1, this is the formula for the discount rate, remember, 1 over 1 plus 0.7, that is 7%, raised to the power 6. That would be raised to the power 5. I'm sorry, this is the 5th year, so it would be raised to the power 5. Then whatever you get over here, you would use it to discount the cost and benefits. So suppose then if it is the 6th year, what would be the formula? The 6th year formula would be 1 plus 1.07 raised to the power 6, and that will give you the discounted rate. Then you would use this number, whatever you get over here, to multiply it with the cost and benefits in the same year, not the previous one, not the future one, in that same year, in the 6th year, remember. Once we are done with that, in the end, what are we going to do? In the end, what we are going to do is come up with total discounted benefits and total discounted costs. Then we will divide, in order to arrive at a conclusion, at a final conclusion, we will divide the total discounted benefits by total discounted costs. And what was the criteria for decision? If this ratio is greater than 1, then it's fine, you can go ahead with the project. If it is less than 1, then don't go ahead with the project. If it is equal to 1, it's still fine, at least it is 1, but there is an element of discretion over here for the policymaker in terms of whether to go ahead with the project or not. So this discounted rate and discounted, in fact the discounted rate was the only difference that we studied, that we mentioned what was different from the previous calculations that we did. So you need to keep this in mind. If I give it to you on the exams or on quizzes, this is I'd be specifically mentioning whether you should discount the rate or not. So keep that in mind. This is what the difference was about, and let's move ahead with the next item on our agenda is risk analysis. Remember that in the previous lecture, when we mentioned the cost benefit analysis, we also mentioned two more: the expenditure analysis or the cost effectiveness analysis, and the risk analysis. Now I'm not going to go through the cost effectiveness analysis in detail because it's very simple. It's just a very simple exercise. Just look at the cost, look at the expenditures that are being incurred on a project, and try to come up with a way to reduce those costs, or to to use them more effectively, to use them more productively. That is all about it. That methodology, it is exclusively fixated upon costs of a project. Risk analysis, it's a bit more complicated than that, what we have been studying over here. What the cost effectiveness analysis is, it's a bit different than cost effectiveness analysis and cost benefit analysis too. Risk analysis is a analysis in terms of public policy and project management, that is simply an exercise of identifying explicitly those risks that may push the project toward failure make it costly or impede its efficiency. अब risks जो होते हैं, जिस तरह मैंने पिछले लेक्चर में कुछ आपको risks का बताया था, किस किस्म के हो सकते हैं, सैलाब आ गया, जल्जला आ गया, कोई अनइवन वो हो गया, बिकॉज रिस्क ये भी हो सकता है, दहशतगर्दी का रिस्क हो सकता है, इट्स अ रिस्क टू गिवन व्हाट हैज बीन हैपनिंग इन द प्रीवियस फ्यू इयर्स. तो इसकी वजह से कोई प्रोजेक्ट जो होता है उसके साथ क्या हो सकता है, वो फेल हो सकता है, फेल भी हो सकता है. यस, अभी मैं आपको एक मिसाल दूंगा कि कौन सा प्रोजेक्ट फेल हुआ, और उसकी वजह से, उस रिस्क की वजह से वो प्रोजेक्ट इतना ज़्यादा कॉस्टली हो सकता है, इतना ज़्यादा महंगा पड़ सकता है कि वो उसको इम्प्लीमेंट करना फिर कोई फ़ायदेमंद ही न रहे, क्योंकि उसके आमदन या उससे कोई जो फ़ायदा हो रहा है वो इतना ज़्यादा ना हो, खर्चे के मुकाबले में वो कम हो, और इम्पीड इट्स एफिशिएंसी, कि वो प्रोजेक्ट की एफिशिएंसी जो है उसको इम्पीड कर सकता है, उसकी वर्किंग को इम्पीड कर सकता है किसी भी तरीके से, एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिवली, फाइनेंशियली, ह्यूमन रिसोर्स वाइज, किसी भी तरीके से. So how would a project go towards failure? How can a risk push that project towards failure? I said that I'm going to give you example. Here it is. The example is, and a very recent one, the failure to implement the polio eradication program. पाकिस्तान दुनिया का मेरे ख्याल में शायद एक दो ही ममालिक रह गए हैं दुनिया में जो कि अफ्रीका में है, जो कि बिल्कुल बॉटम पे है, उनके साथ अब पेयर हो गया है कि यहाँ पे पोलियो वायरस के केसेस सामने आए, पोलियो के केसेस सामने आए हैं. एक वक्त में ख़त्म हो गई थी, अनफॉर्चुनेटली पोलियो अब दोबारा आ गई है, और उसकी वजह से पाकिस्तानियों पे, आपको पता है आजकल एक वो ट्रैवल के एक एडवाइजरी भी लगी हुई है कि आपको जाने से पहले, बाहर मुल्क जाने से पहले, पाकिस्तान का बॉर्डर छोड़ने से पहले जो है, यू नीड टू गेट दोज ड्रॉप्स, पोलियो के कतरे पीने पड़ेंगे ताकि ये कहीं बाहर ना फैला सके. जितने भी अभी बाहर केसेस आए हैं वो पता चला कि उनका वायरस डिटेक्ट हुआ है कि वो पाकिस्तानी स्ट्रेन है. Another of the embarrassments that we have now become so accustomed to in Pakistan. But anyway, फेलियर किस तरह हो सकता है. अब रिस्क लेके इसमें कौन सा था, इसमें कौन सा रिस्क ऐसा था जिसने इसको प्रोग्राम को फेल कर दिया? वो था दहशतगर्दी का रिस्क, वो था एक्सट्रीमिज्म का रिस्क, के जिन इलाकों में इसको इम्प्लीमेंट करने की कोशिश की, कुछ इलाके ऐसे थे, मोस्ट स्पेसिफिकली फेडरल एरिया एडमिनिस्ट्रेड ट्राइबल एरियाज, वहाँ पे आपको पता है कि वहाँ पे हालात अच्छे नहीं है, तो वहाँ पे पोलियो कतरे पिलाने से मना कर दिया गया, विच इज़ वेरी अनफॉर्चुनेट, और उसकी वजह से पोलियो के केसेस सामने आए. जो पाबंदी लगाई गई पोलियो के कतरे पिलाने पे, वो सारा प्रोजेक्ट जो है उधर ही फेल हो गया. अब इस रिस्क को इस प्रोजेक्ट में किसी ने मिटिगेट नहीं किया था या इस चीज को मेंशन नहीं किया था, किसी ने, nobody tried to factor in, and nobody just came up with this, seems to have come up with this analysis that problem of terrorism or the problem of extremism, religious extremism can can substantially reduce the probability of the implementation of the program, and nobody considered that it would fail. It has failed, unfortunately, and that is why there have been so many cases, reported cases of polio, which was once eradicated from Pakistan, and now it has risen again. So crux of the matter, what I am trying to say in short is that risks, a few risks can be substantial, and they could be substantial to the extent that they can lead to the failure of a project. So in risk analysis, what we are doing is trying to figure out, trying to point out what kind of risks there are, try to figure out a way to go around those risks and to mitigate those risks and to make the project successful. Now there are several steps involved in this kind of an analysis. The general ones are as follows. Identify the hazards. Make a complete survey of the probable hazards. These involve an academic exercise and a physical aspect too. The academic exercise concerns the knowledge gained from the research and past experience, while the physical aspect concerns the analyzer or designer of a policy being at the place of proposed project implication by himself or herself in order to assess the on-ground situation. अब इसके दो aspect हैं. इस یہ جو آئیڈینٹیفائنگ دا ہیزرڈز ہیں اس کے 2 اسپیکٹس ہیں کہ ایک تو اکیڈیمک ایکسرسائز ہوتی ہے کہ آپ نے یہاں پہ بیٹھ کے, ہم نے اپنے آفس میں بیٹھ کے یا ریسرچ ایریا میں بیٹھ کے ہم نے ایک پوری تاریخ نکالی اس کی اور دیکھا, فائلز وغیرہ دیکھ لی کہ اچھا کیا یہاں پہ اس سے پہلے اگر کوئی ایکسرسائز اس طرح کی ہوئی تھی, اس سے پہلے اگر اس طرح کی کوئی پالیسی امپلیمنٹ کرنے کی کوشش کی گئی تھی تو اس کا نتیجہ کیا نکلا, کیا وہ سکسیسفل تھی, ڈیڈ اٹ فیل, اگر فیل ہوگی ہے کس وجہ سے ہوئی ہے, اگر اس کا سکسیس ہے اس میں کیا سکسیس کے لیے کیا چیزیں تھی, کیا ٹرینڈز ہیں اس میں, کیا ہمارے لیے اس میں کوئی ایسا سبق ہے جو کہ اب ہم استعمال کر سکتے ہیں, پالیسی جو اس طرح کی ایک اور امپلیمنٹ کرنے جا رہے ہیں, what have we learned from it. This is an academic exercise and it also involves the gathering of data, sampling, all those steps, the quantitative analysis step and maybe the qualitative one, qualitative plus quantitative. Now, but there is another aspect. Whenever you have to identify a hazard, it is extremely important that the person should himself be aware of where the project is being implemented and try to be there in order to gauge for himself that if there is something missing in that area, what is missing. دفتر میں بیٹھ کے کام کرنا, یہاں پہ بیٹھ کے سوچنا, یہاں پہ بیٹھ کے ایک آئیڈیا کے ساتھ آئیڈیا آ گیا جی کہ یہ میرے خیال میں سب سے اچھا بہترین طریقہ کار رہے گا کیونکہ ہم نے جو اسٹڈی کیا ہے اس میں یہی چیزیں سامنے آئی ہے, وہ تو ٹھیک ہے اپنی جگہ, لیکن اگر رسک آئیڈینٹیفیکیشن ہوتی ہے سب سے پہلے ایک بڑی امپورٹنٹ چیز جو ہے, بڑی اہم چیز جو ہے وہ یہ ہے کہ جس علاقے میں اس پروجیکٹ کو امپلیمنٹ کیا جا رہا ہے تاکہ رسک جو ہے اس کو کم کیا جا سکے, خود جا کے اس علاقے کا جائزہ بھی لیا جائے, لوگ وہاں پہ ہوں, آن گراؤنڈ ہوں, جن کو پتا ہو سچویشن کا کہ وہاں پہ ہو کیا رہا ہے, وہاں پہ سوشل نارمز کا ان کو پتا ہو, معاشرتی اقتدار کا ان کو پتا ہو, معاشرتی اقدار کا انفیکٹ ان کو پتا ہو, ناٹ اقتدار, کیا کلچر وہاں پہ کیا ہے, کس طرح, واٹ از دا اکانومی لائک, کیا لوگوں کا ذریعہ معاش کیا ہے, ہاؤ ڈو دے گو اباؤٹ دیئر ایوری ڈے روٹین. یہ چیزیں, یہ آبزرویشن جو ہوتی ہے بڑی ضروری ہوتی ہیں کہ اس میں یہ ڈیفائن کر سکیں, اس میں اس چیز کو سامنے لایا جا سکے کہ اگر ایک پروجیکٹ امپلیمنٹ کیا جا رہا ہے تو یہ جو چیزیں ہیں جو ابھی ہم نے ڈسکس کی ہیں, یہ جو آبزرویشن ہیں لوگوں کے بارے میں, اس علاقے کے بارے میں کیا آبزرویشن ہے, تو اس کی وجہ سے کیا رسک پیدا ہو سکتے ہیں, اس میں کیا ایسی چیزیں ہیں جو ہم نے فگر آؤٹ نہیں کی ہوئی لیکن ہو سکتی ہیں. تو یہ جو ہے نا صرف ایک ایسپیکٹ کہ جی ہم نے ایک اکیڈیمک ایکسرسائز کر لی کہ دفتر میں بیٹھ کے ایک منصوبہ بنا لیا اور ریسرچ اسٹڈی کر لی اور کہا کہ دس وڈ بی فائن, دیٹ از فائن, بٹ دیٹ از اونلی ون ایسپیکٹ آف اٹ. اف یو ہیو ٹو آئیڈینٹیفائی دا رسک, یو ہیو ٹو بی دیئر, try to study the area, try to study its people, try to observe what is happening over there. It will give you a good idea, good hint that if the public policy is implemented the way that research has shown us, what could be probable problems or what could be the probable results. That would give you a good idea of that. The second one, who is in harm's way, means who is vulnerable to risk. It is mostly about identifying groups. For example, in case of construction of dams and hydropower projects, there would be many people who would be facing displacement. This is what we know of. But do we know of the other risks associated with this move? اب یہ آئیڈینٹیفائی کرنا اس میں بہت ضروری ہے کہ اگر کوئی رسک ہے, کسی کو نقصان پہنچنے والا ہے, تو کون ہے وہ لوگ, کون سا گروپ ہے, کوئی انڈیویجولز ہے, کوئی گروپ ہے, کیا نقصان پہنچ سکتا ہے اس کو. What are the risks associated with going ahead with the project? Who would be in the harm's way? For whom would it be harmful and very harmful, less harmful? This distinction, and here I gave you the example of construction of dams and hydropower projects. I gave you this example because dams and hydropower projects, the big ones, they seem to be pretty famous all over the world. They are pretty much in demand. Every country likes them. Every country wants to implement those power projects and hydropower projects. But beyond that, there are not many people willing to go ahead and study what kind of risks that big hydropower projects, big dams tend to pose. That is what we know of. کہ جی یہاں پہ لوگ جو ہوتے ہیں وہ ڈسپلیس ہو سکتے ہیں، یہ اتنا تو ہمیں پتہ ہے، لیکن اس کے علاوہ کس قسم کے رسک فیس ہو سکتے ہیں؟ اب دیکھیں میں آپ کو مثال دوں منگلا ڈیم کی. منگلا ڈیم جب بنا تھا 1960s کی بات ہے، اس میں جو لوگ ڈسپلیس ہوئے تھے میرے خیال میں ابھی جا کے ان کو کہیں 31 سال بعد جا کے ان کو کوئی اپنی جگہ کے مالکانہ حقوق ملے اور ان کی جو ڈسپلیسمنٹ ہے وہ ختم ہوئی ہے، ان کو صحیح جگہ رہنے کی ملی ہے. تو دیکھیں یہ تو ہمیں پتا تھا کہ ڈسپلیس ہوں گے لوگ، لیکن ان کے لیے انتظامات کیا کیے گئے تھے؟ ان کو اپنی جگہ سے ہٹانے کے جب ہٹایا گیا تو ان کو دوسری جگہ پہ آباد کرنے کے لیے کیا انتظامات کیے گئے تھے؟ یہ رسک انہوں نے بھی نہیں پتا تھا. وہ تو ان گڈ فیتھ جب حکومت نے ان کو آرڈر کیا تو وہ وہاں سے چلے گئے، لیکن پھر جب گئے تو ان بیچاروں کو پتا لگا کہ کتنی لمبی اسٹرگل کرنی پڑی ٹو گیٹ سیٹلڈ سم ویئر. اور اس کے ساتھ ان کی مطلب آپ یہ سوچیں کہ what are the risk associated with this move. ابھی بات کرتے ہیں اس پہ. For example, what about risk of settling in a new area, livelihood adjustment, culture, travel, social relationship, health hazards, etc. These sort of things need to be kept in mind before moving ahead with decision making. دیکھیں اس میں ابھی میں نے بات کی کہ جو لوگ اپنا جگہ چھوڑ دیتے ہیں ڈیمز کی بننے کی وجہ سے، اب صرف ڈسپلیسمنٹ کا تو ہمیں پتہ ہے، لیکن ہمیں یہ پتہ ہے کہ جب دوسرے علاقوں میں جائیں گے کیا وہاں پہ وہ لوگ ایکسیپٹیبل ہوں گے بھی؟ اپنا ذریعہ معاش جو کہ وہ ایک خاص طریقے سے ان کا ایک ذریعہ معاش تھا پہلے، کیا وہ اس علاقے میں بھی وہ اسی طریقے سے پل بڑھ سکیں گے؟ آمدن کا ان کا کیا ذریعہ ہوگا؟ کلچر کیسا ہے؟ کیا ان کا لوگوں کے ساتھ جو ملاپ ہے وہ ٹھیک رہے گا یا اس کی وجہ سے مسئلے پیدا ہوں گے؟ دو مثالیں میں آپ کو دیتا ہوں. کراچی میں آپ دیکھ لیں کہ کراچی میں ایک تو انڈیجنس پاپولیشن ہے اور بڑا مسئلہ جو بنا ہوا ہے، اور پھر جو باہر سے آئے ہیں جو ڈسپلیس ہوئے اپنی جگہ سے، مثلا جنگ کی وجہ سے ڈسپلیس ہوئے ہیں. تو پشاور میں آپ دیکھ لیں کہ کتنے زیادہ پورے ملک میں لیکن پشاور میں خاص طور پہ جو ہے افغان مہاجرین کتنی زیادہ تعداد میں ہیں، جو کہ افغانستان کی جب جنگ ہوئی تھی سوویت یونین کے خلاف، وہ اس میں کتنے لوگ ڈسپلیس ہو کے یہاں پہ آئے تھے. اب ان کے لیے آسان نہیں تھا. ابھی تک وہ بہت سے ان میں سے جو کہ اب ظاہر ہے بہت اچھا رہ رہے ہیں، ان کا سارا کاروبار وغیرہ ذریعہ معاش ہے، لیکن بہت سے ابھی بھی ہیں جو کہ ابھی تک اپنی جگہ پہ نہیں آئے. دے موو فرام پلیس ٹو پلیس. کہنے کا مقصد یہ ہے کہ وہ جب اپنی جگہ سے ڈسپلیس ہوئے کسی نے نہیں سوچا تھا کہ ان کے لیے کیا کیا مسئلے پیدا ہوں گے. سملرلی جب سیلاب آئے اچانک، ان کی وجہ سے جو ڈسپلیسمنٹ ہوئی اور ابھی تک جو لوگ واپس نہیں گئے اپنی جگہوں پہ، ان کے لیے کیا کیا مسئلے ہیں، وہ بھی میرے خیال میں کبھی اس چیز کا اندازہ لگانے کی کوشش نہیں کی گئی کوئی پراپر. اب لائیولیہڈ ایڈجسٹمنٹ، اب اس میں جو میں نے مثال دی تھی منگلا ڈیم اور اس کے متاثرین کی. اب ٹیک دا ایگزامپل، فار ایگزامپل کہ اگر جو ان کا ذریعہ معاش ہے وہ زیادہ تر وہ بھیڑ بکریاں چرانے والا ہے کہ اسی کے تھرو وہ گزارا کرتے ہیں. زیادہ تر جو یہ ماؤنٹینس ایریاز ہوتے ہیں، پہاڑی علاقے ہوتے ہیں، اس میں ذریعہ معاش اسی طرح کا ہوتا ہے. تو کیا اگر وہ ایک فلیٹ لینڈ میں آ جائیں گے، ایک ہموار جگہ پہ آ جائیں گے، کیا ان کے لیے مشکل نہیں ہوگی کہ بکریاں چرانا، ان کے لیے چارے کا انتظام کرنا، پھر جگہ ڈھونڈنا کہ جہاں پہ ان کو فیڈنگ کی جا سکے؟ کہنے کا مقصد یہ جو اتنی باتیں میں نے بیان کی ہے کہ دیز آر سورٹ آف رسکس دیٹ ون نیڈس ٹو کیپ ان مائنڈ when you are going ahead with policy decision making. The third one is evaluate the risk. The third step is evaluation both in monetary and non-monetary terms of the risk that the analyzer sees. Analyze whether the risks are worth including in the programs and try to rank them from the highest to the lowest. اب یہ third step ہے کہ ایک دفعہ آپ نے risks as a public policy analyzer you have identified the risk, you have come up with a list of risks that these are the kind of risks that I believe as a public policy analyzer that I believe these would impede the program or would be part of the program or part of the implementation, would come with the implementation of the program, to say the least, both in monetary and non-monetary terms. Wherever possible, try to put a monetary figure on the risk. Suppose if there is flooding and there is risk of displacement, then try to figure in what would be the cost of feeding those displaced people, what would be the cost of taking those people back to their areas and building a home for them again. That can be done pretty much in terms of monetary standards or monetary or rupee cost. You can put a you can put a number on it, a rupee number on it. But when it comes to non-monetary terms, it might be difficult to comprehend putting them in money terms. I just gave you the example of those people who are shepherds and they are displaced from the area, just as an example. Now it's difficult to just quantify all those costs, all those risks that they have to go through. Then analyze whether the risks are worth including in the program. Talk with people about this. Talk with your management, talk with the people around you who are part of the program, and see whether is it worth including in this program, is it not worth including in this program, what are your thoughts, what are the other people's thoughts. There might be many people who already have an experience with this thing, and they might be able to guide you what to do about it. And try to rank them from the highest to the lowest. In this step, one of the things that you need to do is to come up with a list that, look, I think this is the highest risk that is going to be a problem for the program. Then start going down and try to identify, this is the lowest risk, this is the highest risk, this is what I believe is going to happen. The probability of this risk, you can put it this way, probability of this kind of risk occurring is high, or probability of this kind of risk occurring is low. So make a hierarchy, make a rank out of them. The fourth one, implementing the findings. Once analyzed, the findings should be presented and shared with the decision makers, something that I just mentioned. In order for their incorporation into the project hazards and risks, sharing the findings increases the chances of better advice in this regard and of identified becoming a focus in the project implementation. Number 5, it's about the review, assessment and updating. This step is more in line with the new developments and new information availability that may alter the nature of risks. In that case, the profile of risk would need to be updated. Remember, we've mentioned it many times, I've mentioned it many times in the lecture, that world doesn't sit still, everything doesn't sit still, keeps changing, especially when there is flow of information, good flow of information, fast flow of information. And agents, groups, individuals, households are able to change their preferences and able to change their decisions instantly in the short run. So with those changes, with those change in scenario, let's say, there is a possibility that new risks might arise, or the nature of the already identified risks, that might change from suppose a risk identified as having a high probability of occurring within the new situation, it might become a risk that has a low probability of occurring, or the risk that has a very low probability of occurring. In change of circumstances, in lieu of the change of circumstances, it might become a risk that has a high probability of occurring. So you have to keep those changes in view. Whatever is occurring in the outside world, whatever is changing, what is it, what has changed, and identify the new possibilities. That's the 5th part of this risk analysis. Now, risk assessment example, work safety in a factory. Why have I mentioned a factory over here? I've just made a very simple performer. This is just a example. It's not necessary that as an analyzer you need to follow this one. You might have your own ideas, which is a very welcome move, which is a very good one. There might be something missing in this. This is just an example to clarify to you this concept of how do you make a risk assessment analysis. Gave you the example of work safety in a factory. Now, why have I mentioned a factory? Because the governments all over the world, they are into this business of establishing industries and factories for production. In Pakistan, we have quite a few. We have a history with this, from producing phosphate to cement factories. There are quite a few government establishments, and a lot of them have been privatized over the years, but there are quite a few substantial ones. Take the example of Pakistan Steel Mills. It's a vast infrastructure with thousands of employees. So over there, it's a workplace. There are certain risks involved in workplaces, from small ones to large ones like Pakistan Steel. So if a risk assessment analysis has to be made, then the analyzer has to come up with a proper analysis. This is an example. It could be anything. It could be very different than this. It depends upon the preferences of those who are analyzing and the decision makers. What do they come up with? Remember that in that example, the madrasa example, in one of the lectures that we discussed, that practical example of madrasa reform program, it was this pro forma or this questionnaire that the decision makers first designed and trained people for it. So it was then implemented or then tried first on 2 madrasas. It was implemented over there in, I believe it was in the capital that it was implemented first, only in 2 randomly selected madrasas. And in lieu of the observations made, it was modified, and then the final version was prepared. So this might be a very initial version, it might be a final version. Initial version has to be come up by the analyzer, that this is, I believe, what these risks are and how to go about this study. Then when you share it with the management, you share it with other people, they give you other ideas. That perhaps you should take out something, perhaps you should add something. And then when you are at the implementation level, suppose there is a certain government institution or government factory or even a private factory which you want to go ahead and analyze for risk, then you can carry it over there. Once you implement it, you might get some new insight, you might get some additions to the performer. So I'm not saying this is the final performer. The final one is would only come up after you implement this initial perform or initial risk assessment analysis somewhere. Once you implement it, then you'll get a good idea of how to go about it, whether that is right or whether there are other changes to be made to it. Now, first of all, over here, what I've identified is hazards. Rank the hazards. What kind of hazards could there be? Let's write down a few, just as a mental exercise. So what could be the probable hazards in a factory? Fire. That's one of the probable hazards. Who might be harmed and how? Of course, labor. How? Because they are working near those machines that can catch fire. Just as an example, what has already been done, you look at the history and implementation or administrative measures of it. Anything else needed to control risks, meaning new. What do you propose that something new should be? What is missing over here? What should we bring in over here? Then action by who? Who should take this action? Of course, over here that would be management of the factory. By when? Now this is important because things in Pakistan, at least in Pakistan, happens in other countries too, but specifically happens over here. That is what I've seen as far as project implementation is concerned. That things keep getting delayed. By when? Just specify time. Time constraint. I don't have the space to write over here, but this is what it should be like. Time constraint. Follow up. Follow up means evaluation and monitoring. this was one hazard, and this is how you tend to write down all these in all these categories and identify the risk, and then who might be harmed and how. Second one, suppose, now this is just a mental exercise, this is not necessarily true, it happens in the real world, these kind of things happen. Fires are a common occurrence and a big hazard in many factories. What else could be, what else can we add to this kind of risk? Let's think about food. I think that's a big hazard, big risk because since I have been associated with the government, I have worked with them. In many of the government canteens, in many of the government establishments, there is usually a canteen, and in those canteens, the food, the quality of food that they serve, that is very low. To say the least, that is substandard and very harmful too, because in those food, everything from cockroaches to lizards have been found in the cooked food. So not trying to scare you or make you nauseating, but this is the reality. So just trying to say that it is a risk to, it poses a risk to the one who eats that food, who consumes that food. So who might be harmed and how? Well, everybody, from ordinary labor to management. What has already been done? Again, history, bit of history plus ask the service provider. Service provider. I'm just going to abbreviate it because I don't have the space over here. Anything else needed to control that risk? What do you propose? Ask around people, ask around the ones who are already sitting over there in that food establishment, in that canteen. What kind of problems have they found? And then what could be done? It's the same as new, but you can write what can be done. Action by who? Of course, government officials. Those who are at the helm of affairs, officers in a particular organization. यहाँ पे ये चीज़ याद रखिएगा कि मैं गवर्नमेंट की एक मिसाल ले रहा हूँ, गवर्नमेंट की एक फैक्ट्री की, गवर्नमेंट की कोई भी इस्टेब्लिशमेंट है, वहाँ पे जिस तरह ये कैंटीन्स वगैरह होती है, उस सिलसिले में एग्जांपल ले रहा हूँ, इसीलिए मैं गवर्नमेंट ऑफिशियल्स मेंशन कर रहा हूँ. प्राइवेट इंस्टीट्यूशन में जाहिर है वो प्राइवेट मैनेजमेंट होगी जो इस चीज़ पे एक्शन लेगी. By when? Again the same things. Repeat, time constraint. This is how you write this thing, abbreviate, repeat, and then follow up, monitoring and evaluation. Right. So in the next two slots that I have left empty, try to think about this thing. What kind of risks does what kind of risk can you come up with? Can you imagine? Now, don't limit yourself to a canteen in a government establishment or a factory in a government establishment. You can make up your example by yourself, whatever you want to do. It would be just as a practice, as I said, as a policy analyzer, you would need to do these things. You would need to be intuitive. You would need to make use of this thing to come up with ideas. So the slots that I have left over here, that I have left empty over here, is for you to practice, for you to think about certain risks and try to fill in this form the way I did. Even you can add to it so that it gives you good practice. Again, I might even ask you a question about these things. You should be able to answer those. That is pretty much it for as far as risk analysis is concerned. I remember I said that we studied the major criterias, and I discussed the major criterias in detail. This was one of the sub criterias or the sub methodologies. The risk analysis is a sub methodology when considering the impact and the use of cost benefit analysis, or the IRR, or the present values. It's not used that frequently in terms of public policy analysis. In other places, like in the private sector, let me tell you, the person who is good at risk, analyzing risk and coming up with or computing risk, they are in high demand. They get paid very well. But that is the other sector, the private sector, especially, and it is important for the private sector for the reason that they are the ones who are investing in other countries. They are the ones who are investing in places that they don't know of, so it carries risks. So they need a person who can carry a very good assessment of that risk, a masterly analysis of that risk, and come up with strategies to mitigate that risk. But for the public policy discourse, what I've taught you this much is, this is pretty much what is used over here. There is, I haven't seen, at least I haven't seen, if there is there, I haven't seen it during my association with the government. I haven't seen any complex computations being carried out in terms of risk analysis. It's usually this mental exercise, just write it down, make a pro forma, and come up with these things and try to mitigate these things. That is pretty much it. So it should be okay for you too. You don't need to go into the complexities of that. If you want to, anyway, if you are interested in the complexities of risk and how to calculate it, then you need to be good at mathematics and statistics. That is all mathematical and statistical, and believe me, very tough computing, very complex models. I tried it once myself, but then gave up on them immediately because they were pretty difficult. Now, back to tax imposition. We talked about tax imposition in previous lectures, and the reason I concentrate on these things a lot are that these are practical life experiences. This is what you would encounter in your practical life. So you need to be good at this thing. You need to be up to date on these things. The case of producer and consumer surplus in terms of tariffs and quotas. Now we are moving to international trade. In one of the coming lectures, I will talk about international trade. Its significance. It's a huge part of economies nowadays, and from what we have, the kind of evidence and the kind of research that has been done, it says that trade is beneficial overall. The latest example is the North America Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, United States, and Canada. A long term, it was signed in 1990s, early 1990s, I believe, or the late 1980s. A study has been carried out recently, and it has come up with this conclusion that all these three countries have benefited tremendously from this arrangement, from free trade agreement. This is free trade. So many of the agreements are just trade agreements, but this is free trade agreement. When we are talking about a free trade agreement, it means that the flow of goods and services across borders without any taxation or without any restriction. That is free trade. And ask economists who have studied this thing, and once we go through the basics in the coming lecture of trade, economists are hugely in favor of it. That yes, trade is overall beneficial. There might be a few people for whom that kind of trade might not be good. Who they are, we will definitely discuss in the coming lectures when we discuss trade. But for overall, there is this unanimous conclusion. There is this unanimity of view that trade overall is very beneficial. Now, one thing that happens in trade, one thing that is associated normally with trade is tariffs and quotas. The difference between tariff and quota, remember tariff and quota both are taxes. जिस तरह आमतौर पर टैक्स लगाया जाता है, इनकम से टैक्स लिया जाता है, आमदन से टैक्स लिया जाता है, या कोई और सेल्स टैक्स हो गया, ये भी टैरिफ और कोटा जो होता है ये भी एक किस्म का टैक्स होता है. ये ट्रेड से रिलेटेड है, तिजारत से रिलेटेड है. द डिफरेंस बिटवीन टैरिफ एंड कोटा is that in tariff there is no restriction on quantity imported, but quota is applied specifically for restricting the imported units. देखें टैरिफ और कोटा में डिफरेंस ये है कि टैरिफ उसमें कोई पाबंदी नहीं है कि कितनी तादाद में सामान बाहर से आ रहा है, जितना मर्जी आता जाए, एज लॉन्ग एज द इम्पोर्टर कैन पे द टैक्स. जितना मर्जी सामान आता जाए, बस वो टैक्स पे करना है आपने हुकूमत को. जो टैक्स हुकूमत ने लगाया है वो आपने पर यूनिट जो टैक्स लगा होता है वो पे करना होता है. کوٹا جو ہوتا ہے اس کے مقابلے میں یہ بھی ایک قسم کا ٹیکس ہوتا ہے، لیکن یہ ڈیزائن کیا جاتا ہے اسپیسیفکلی کہ یونٹ جو ہے جو امپورٹ کیے جا رہے ہیں اس کی تعداد جو ہے اس کو کم سے کم رکھا جائے. کتنے ایک ہو سکتی ہے؟ مثلاً حکومت یہ کہہ سکتی ہے، بہت سی پاکستان میں ریکنڈیشن گاڑیاں بہت زیادہ آتی ہیں اور کافی یہاں پہ مقبول بھی ہیں، لوگوں کی ڈیمانڈ بڑی ہے. حکومت یہ پابندی لگا سکتی ہے اور ان نے ماضی میں لگائی بھی تھی کہ اس سال صرف 1000 یونٹس امپورٹ کیے جا سکتے ہیں، اور وہ اس کوالٹی کے ہوں، اتنے سی سی انجن ہوں اس میں، اور اس سے زیادہ نہیں. یہ ریسٹرکشن حکومت لگا. بہرحال کوٹا یہ ہوگا کہ ٹوٹل یونٹس پہ لگاتی ہے کہ اتنے 1000 گاڑیاں امپورٹ کی جا سکتی ہیں، اس سے زیادہ نہیں امپورٹ کی جا سکتی. تو یہ کوٹا اور ٹیرف میں ڈفرنس ہے. ٹیرف میں یہ نہیں کہتے کہ کتنی گاڑیاں امپورٹ کر سکتے، وہ کہتے ہیں 10,000 کر لے، خیر ہے، لیکن ٹیکس جو ہے وہ پے کرنا پڑے گا. کوٹا میں یہ نہیں ہوتا. کوٹا میں یہ ہوتا ہے کہ نہیں 10,000 نہیں، صرف 1,000 گاڑیاں امپورٹ کرنی ہیں، اس سے زیادہ نہیں امپورٹ کر سکتے. گرافیکل انالیسس کس طرح اس کا کیا جاتا ہے؟ اس کا جب یہ ٹیرف اور کوٹا لگایا جاتا ہے اس میں سوال یہ پیدا ہوتا ہے، جیسا کہ میں نے بات کی کہ نقصان کی اور اس میں فائدے کی. تو اس نقصان اور فائدے کو ہم جانچنے کی کوشش کرتے ہیں پروڈیوسر اور کنزیومر سرپلس کی زبان میں، جیسا کہ کرائٹیریا میں، جیسا کہ ہم نے پچھلے لیکچرز میں کیا وہ گرافیکل انالیسس میں. ابھی ہم ٹریڈ کے بارے میں آگے لیکچرز میں پڑھیں گے اور اچھا خاصا پڑھیں گے، اس لیے کیونکہ ٹریڈ، ٹیکسیشن، یہ چیزیں جو ہے یہ امپورٹنٹ پبلک پالیسیز ہیں. دیکھیں جب تک اکانومی نہیں ہے، اکنامک حالات اچھے نہیں ہیں، تو آج کل ساری بات ہے اکانومی پہ. جب تک اکانومی چائنا کی اچھی نہیں تھی تو اسے کوئی پوچھتا نہیں تھا. اب اکانومی اس کی اونلی بیہائنڈ دا یونائٹڈ اسٹیٹ، دنیا کی دوسری بڑی اکانومی ہو گئی ہے، تو اب ہر بندہ اس کے پاس دوڑتا ہے. انڈیا ایک زمانے میں وہ ہم سے بھی بیچارے پیچھے تھے، بیچارے تو نہیں کہوں گا سوری، لیکن یہ کہ وہ پیچھے تھے کافی ہم سے ترقی کے معاملے میں، بلیو اٹ اور ناٹ. لیکن پھر اچانک 1990 سے شروع ہو کے انہوں نے جب ٹریڈ اپنی اوپن کی، لبرلائز کی. پہلے ایک وقت میں ٹریڈ انڈیا کی بڑی ریسٹرکٹڈ تھی، وہ زیادہ امپورٹس نہیں کرتے تھے. وہ جو کانسیپٹ ہے خود انحصاری کا، کہ ہم خود انحصاری پہ سب کچھ کرنے کی کوشش کریں گے، زیادہ امپورٹ باہر سے نہیں آئے گی. لیکن پھر جب اس کا نقصان زیادہ ہوا، اس کا فائدہ نہیں ہوا، کوئی کم ہی فائدہ ہوا. لیکن جب ٹریڈ کو اوپن کیا گیا 1990 کی دہائی میں، اس کے بعد انڈیا کی اقتصادی ترقی جو ہے وہ چائنا کی طرح کافی تیز رہی ہے. آپ دیکھ لیں انڈیا کہاں پہ ہے اب. انڈیا جو ہے اب ہر ملک جو ہے وہ انڈیا اور چائنا کے پیچھے دوڑ رہا ہے، اور یہ سب اقتصادی ترقی پہ ہے. تو اقتصادی ترقی جو ہوتی ہے، اقتصادیات جو ہوتی ہیں، کوئی بھی اکانومی ہوتی ہے، اس کا بہت بڑا ایک امپورٹنٹ ایسپیکٹ جو ہوتا ہے وہ ٹریڈ ہے، تجارت ہے. اور جیسا کہ میں نے کہا کہ یہاں پہ ایک یونانیمٹی ہے کہ تقریباً سبھی اکانومسٹ، اقتصادی ماہر آپ کو یہ کہتے ہوئے نظر آئیں گے، ایگری کریں گے کہ جو ٹریڈ ہے وہ اوور آل بینیفیشل ہے، اس کا فوائد بہت ہیں. اب مثلا پاکستان میں ایک بڑا مسئلہ کیا ہے؟ بڑا مسئلہ ایک یہ ہے کہ بھارت کے ساتھ تجارت کرنی ہے نہیں کرنی. ابھی تک بہت ریسٹرکٹڈ تجارت ہے، بہت ہی کم تجارت ہوتی ہے. اب جتنے بھی اکانومسٹ سے آپ پوچھیں تو وہ آپ کو یہی بتائیں گے کہ ضرور کرنی چاہیے ہمیں، اور اوپن ٹریڈ کرنی چاہیے اپنے ساتھ جو نیبر میں، ہمارے نیبرہڈ میں جو ہمارے ہمسائے ممالک ہیں، ایران ہو گیا، افغانستان ہو گیا، بھارت ہو گیا، چائنا ہو گیا، ان کے ساتھ ہمیں ٹریڈ کرنی چاہیے اور اوپن ٹریڈ رکھنی چاہیے. اس کا ہمیں فائدہ زیادہ ہوگا، نقصان کم ہوگا. ابھی تک ہوا نہیں ہے، لیکن جب یہ دیکھیں اگر کوئی پالیسی اس طرح کی امپلیمنٹ ہوتی ہے تو اس کے بعد پتہ لگے گا کہ کتنا نقصان ہے، کتنا فائدہ ہے. نارملی اس طرح کے ایگریمنٹس کا فائدہ زیادہ ہوتا ہے، نقصان کم ہوتا ہے. اینی وے we talked about imposing a quota and tariff, which is usually done, and what it means for the producer and consumer surplus, the two categories of people that we normally divide. Over here we'll see that government also comes in, but let's draw a graph. The first case would be, so what would be the first case? Let's start with the imposition of a tariff. First of all, let me just write it down. Tariff and quota are both forms of a tax. They are a tax. And the first case that we are going to consider over here, in fact let me just bring it over here, is the case 1, let's say. Imposition of a tariff. Imposition of a tariff and what it does to producer and consumer surplus. Remember, the main question over here is what the imposition of a tax as far as trade is concerned, what would it do to producer and consumer surplus? Here is the question, important one, producer and consumer surplus in terms of tariffs and quotas. So this is the first one. Let me just draw it out. Again the y-axis, again the x-axis, you have the price over here, you have the quantity over here. Now let's do the simple demand and analysis stuff. Demand, downward sloping, ask yourself, let it be an MCQ, why is it downward sloping? Upward sloping, that is supply. This is turning out to be a good picture. I'm getting used to this stuff now. This is the equilibrium point where there is this price P naught. Now this price P naught, price without trade. कोई ट्रेड नहीं हो रही, कोई तजारत नहीं हो रही, और ये जो है किसी एक गुड की, हम सिर्फ एक गुड की बात कर रहे हैं, हम किसी 5-6 उसकी बात नहीं कर रहे, ज़्यादा की बात नहीं कर रहे, कि ये उसकी कीमत है उसके बगैर, ट्रेड के बगैर. अब फॉर द सेक ऑफ आर्ग्यूमेंट, सपोज वी कंक्लूड अ फ्री ट्रेड एग्रीमेंट विद एनी कंट्री, और जिसके पास वो गुड जिसकी हम बात कर रहे हैं, वो चीज़ जिसकी हम यहाँ पे बात कर रहे हैं, जिसकी कीमत ये P नॉट है, वो उसके पास वाफिर मकदार में मौजूद है, उसके पास काफ़ी अच्छी खासी मकदार में मौजूद है. द कंट्री दैट वी आर कंक्लूडिंग अ फ्री ट्रेड एग्रीमेंट विद हैज़ लॉट्स ऑफ इट, whose price over here is this P naught. What could that be? Let me give you an example. Natural gas. If we can conclude a free trade agreement with Iran, Iran has lots and lots of natural gas. So this gas prices over here, what do you expect it to happen if there is a free trade agreement with Iran over the supply of gas, which is not costly, of course. We are this is just a simplistic, very simplistic model or graphical analysis. So what would happen when there is ample supply of that thing, when trade is open and it starts flowing in without any tariff, without any quota? This is what would happen. Price would come down over here. This would be the no price. P1 at quantities Q1. This is relative to demand and supply. Q1. Now remember what we did in the simple demand and supply analysis. If you remember this from the last lectures, not the Pareto optimality analysis, no, I'm just talking about the simple demand analysis. I told you that this area over here, that A is the consumer surplus, B is the consumer surplus for producer, this is the producer surplus, this is the consumer surplus. This whole area, this I'm talking before trade, this whole area over here, this is the producer surplus. Let me just write it down. And this is the consumer surplus. Producer surplus before trade. B. Consumer surplus before trade. When this kind of these things, they basically mean that you're repeating the same thing as above or as before. So I'm repeating all this thing over here, except for the fact that it's consumer now, which I've written over here. That would be A, this area A. So these triangular areas, this is before trade. Now when the price comes down, because now there is ample supply of gas, price comes down to P1. What happens to the consumer and producer surplus? There is this new area over here. जैसा कि आप देख सकते हैं एक नया area यहाँ पे बन गया है. Let us say this is area C. This is then after trade takes place, price equals to P1. What's the consumer surplus? In fact, why not do it in the other lecture? Because I don't want to get ahead with a lot of stuff at this time, and probably we are out of time too. But anyway, this is a simple graphical illustration we'll be carrying on in the next lecture, definitely. So keep this in mind, how we have drawn this stuff. I'll be drawing it again. We'll be going through every step of it. You need to keep this in mind because this is a very important aspect of trade and tax policy. But before going and saying goodbye for this lecture, I would like to go through the very summary of the lecture, what we did. In this lecture, we studied the risk analysis. This is a small part of this public policy analysis. Major one being the cost-benefit analysis, which is used, which is most common in use. But over here, I went through the scenarios where risk analysis might be important and maybe more pertinent to use. Then we went through an example, a sample performer, where I wrote down a few criteria of how do you carry out a risk assessment. And in the last, we discussed about something, a very brief. We had I gave you a very brief introduction of tariffs and quotas, which is a form of tax that the government imposes on imports. So this is related to trade. We are not finished with it. We're not finished with the graphical analysis. We'll continue on with this. This is important. We'll continue on in the next lecture. But till that time, take it easy. Have a nice time. Allah Hafiz.